a glass of this ask. Oh, you can hear me? Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, good. Yes, I got my water.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. Heard my jokes. Glass of this ask.
All right. Well, without further ado, we'll get to the exciting part of the evening. So Jillian and Ryan are going to tell us about the oil sands tailings pond issue, and they're going to run through a report that they put out in the spring. Spring? Yeah. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So yeah, they're going to talk about that issue and also the issue of potentially treating and releasing the effluent into the Athabasca River. So Ryan is, as I mentioned, a GIS specialist, and so he's been doing all kinds of mapping for all of our projects and led on all of the images that you'll see with these maps. And Jillian leads our Boreal program and has been leading on this work aside from the mapping, I guess. But it's definitely been a very much a science team collaboration.
Yes. Yes.
All right, well, thanks, Tisha, for that introduction. Yeah, well, Jillian.
Yes, so we just wanted to, take things down, kick back, relax a little, have a casual conversation with everyone here. We decided what we wanted to do was just kind of tell the stories of how we're connected to this issue of the oil sands in the Athabasca River, and kind of just set the foundation for what kind of has brought Ryan and I to this work. And yeah, we'll do that.
All right, well, so yeah, I guess just to begin this, maybe Jillian, can you tell us how your journey to the tailings began?
Yes, thank you. So I have lived in Alberta for about half a decade now, but I'm actually not from here. I did grow up in Ontario, but I always kind of felt this connection. I kind of felt drawn to Alberta. And the first time that I ever fell in love with the province was back in 2001. So I was actually 8 years old here. This, you can tell, same. Oh no. Can we get the backlights on still? Just to keep it, like it's a fire site.
Yeah.
So in 2001, my family did a road trip out to Alberta. And my mom and dad had the whole itinerary planned down to the hour. We did all of the kind of quintessential Alberta experiences back then. We went to Drumheller. I learned about the dinosaurs. We did the gondola in Banff National Park. And at the top of that list, though, my mom wouldn't stop talking about how we were going to go to the Athabasca Glacier as well on this trip. So as an 8-year-old, the only concept of glaciers that I had at that point was basically what I had watched on David Attenborough documentaries and TV shows. So glaciers meant to me like icebergs and the Arctic and polar bears. And so I had a really hard time understanding what that would be like as we drove into the mountains to see this glacier. And then when I got there, I had my other kind of first taste of Alberta, which was drinking the headwaters, the glacial water. So when I first got there, I remember being first struck by just the size of what I was standing on. I couldn't believe that I was standing on a glacier, that we had driven on it. And then when my mom told me to go fill up my water bottle with water and drink it, I was even more shocked by this, because the only frame of reference that I had for freshwater was Lake Ontario and Hamilton Harbor, which is a horrible example of water quality. So I was just blown away that you could even do this. And
Yeah.
oh,
and
you got to go back
yeah,
to the other
yeah.
side. And I filled up this
Yeah.
this
And you look
glass.
pretty thrilled looking at that. Yeah, filling up your water bottle there. How did it feel to be able to sip some water right from that glacier?
Yeah, I remember thinking that this was the cleanest water that I've ever drank in my life. I remember when I learned that this water flows into the Athabasca River and flows through the whole province. As a child, as an 8-year-old, I was like, that's amazing. This must be one of the most cherished things in Alberta. This must be one of the most protected rivers in the whole country. And this is, it would be, surely nobody would take this for granted. And that was my kind of perception of this area, my first perception. But Ryan, so you grew up in Alberta.
That's right.
And so have you ever been to the Athabasca Glacier?
Yeah, next slide. So I love that you mentioned, going to the glacier. So this is me. I'm the one in the center in the white shirt. And now that I look at this photo, I see, so that's my brother and sister, and we're all wearing somewhat matching track pants there from the early 90s. Yeah, so I'm about, I think I'm about 10 in that picture. And yeah, that's us also visiting the glacier. And the reason we went up there was that we had some family from out of town who came to visit us here in Edmonton, and we took them out to like the best spots of the province to go see like the most natural, the most pristine spots of what we showcase to the world as Albertans, and the places that, like here's the wilderness, and you can come experience that here in Alberta. So that was a family trip with people from out of town, because I grew up here. Yeah, my dad was a welder, and he had the chance to work at many different industrial sites across the province. So one of our other like family vacations was to head up to Fort McMurray, and this is during the early 1990s. This is the Syncrude mine site. He was up there for one of the turnarounds, back in the early 1900s or 1990s. And when we went up there, we went to see the museum. The Oil Sands Discovery Center just opened up in the mid-80s, I believe. And then we were able to go up. This is along the main highway, so you can go up there and you would be able to see these massive machineries at work, just digging up the soil. And at the time, this was like a marvel of human ingenuity to be able to get the oil out of these tar sands. And I remember being there, looking at the massive trucks. You could see them going up that ramp on the side. This area would eventually become a tailings pond on the left, and then on the center part is the end pit lake, which is the final landscape of the Mildred mine. The next slide shows another part of the mining. So this is back in the mid 1990s. They were also using the bucket wheels to mine, to dig up the dirt, and then it would go on the conveyor belt and then be sent to the processing plant. So I remember when I was up there, I was so impressed by those that when we were at the Discovery Center, I went and bought one of the little paper models of this little bucket wheel, and I kept that model for many years. I put it on top of my piano. So whenever I was playing piano, I would still see this this marvel of what it was to be Albertan, to be able to like conquer nature, be able to do the impossible and get the oil out of which should be an impossible feat. And back at the Discovery Center, like when people were giving demonstrations on it, you should see how excited people were to be able to just add the boiling water to the sand. You would be able to shake it, and
simple.
The amazingness of this.
Yes. Yeah, so the next time that I saw the Athabasca River for me was actually when I was 25 years old. So much farther along than 8. And at this time, I actually saw it from a helicopter. Was this my next experience with it? I was doing research at the time. I was actually flying in a helicopter up to some research sites that were just south of Wood Buffalo National Park. So we would leave from Fort Mac and we would fly over. A little bit of the route is along the Athabasca River. And this time, you know, many years of school later, a little bit less of the naivete of an 8-year-old, a little bit more scarred by the realities of the world. I had definitely different eyes when I looked from the helicopter onto an area that I knew from research, from papers, reading that this really heavy industrial development, like this is driving caribou declines. There's this very clear link. Declines, especially in Alberta, you're seeing these really, these herds really plummet. And what I would see from the helicopter, actually on the next slide, were these kinds of views. And I think I definitely had a little bit less of a romantic experience than when I was 8 years old. This was shocking. This was, you know, levels of destruction that, or, you know, alteration of a landscape that I just couldn't really comprehend. And I think what I had manifested when I was young of this idea that this was a really precious resource and that this was the cleanest water in the world kind of deteriorated as I looked at these thousands of kilometers of seismic lines, these roads to these well pads, these pump jacks, these roads that intersect streams and wetlands, and you know, these older lines that just go on for, and they just seemed endless. And I mean, what might have been some of the cleanest water, you know, in the mountains, just it seemed impossible that that water could still be just as clean as it flowed through this area. And it just seemed like so much development. It was all so close to the river. And, you know, I think that my perception changed pretty quickly. Some flags started going off, certainly.
Yeah, I also got to go revisit the tailings about 10 years after going up to Athabasca Glacier as well. So this is me, I guess maybe about 20 years ago, while tree planting up in Northern Alberta. And Jillian, in fact, I was tree planting in the area where you were seeing all those seismic lines and caribou up in northeastern Alberta. But unexpectedly, as part of that tree planting, I got to, we had a contract through a company to go up to the Suncor base mine site and do some tree planting work along one of their tailings ponds. So you could see us sort of just setting up our tree cache down at the bottom center photo there. And then that slope is the edge of one of the tailings ponds. So I remember going up there. This is actually right by the main security gate at Suncor. You get off the main highway and then you actually go through past the tailings pond before the main gate. And then the area that I was to plant was right alongside that main gate. So I get on the bus, get off the bus there, and then I'm at this piece of land, that I'm supposed to plant. The first thing I noticed while I was tree planting there was you take your shovel and you drive it in to get the biggest hole so you can put your tree seedling in. Was how hard the soil was and how quickly you just slam onto the dirt. So maybe when I was planting there, I maybe got about 5 centimeters into the ground before you hit like a solid silt layer. Of course, the tree plugs, like the root of the tree plug is like this, right? So the tree will have a difficult chance of getting established there. And in fact, the reason I was there was because it was planted a few years earlier, and we were going back there to refill all the spots where the trees weren't able to survive the conditions that were on that line. So yeah, that top left photo is the area that I was planting for a bit. The other thing that you know while I was planting is that as it's a tailings pond, they do have some bird deterrent systems along the edge, and the one that was imprinted in my mind are these air cannons, which are used to keep the birds from flying onto the waters there. So when you're planting, you make your rows back and forth and back and forth. So I would have to constantly go in front of these air cannons, which would just go off at random times, right? So they can't make it routine, or else the birds will get used to it. So just whenever the air cannon will go off, and then you just
Yeah, I can't imagine, like, that'd be so uncomfortable.
Yeah, because you can't really, you won't know when it's going to happen, that you just have to mentally prepare, but you can never be comfortable. And it's meant to be like that as well, that it won't be comfortable because it could go off at any time.
Yeah, so it just kind of feels like you're always waiting for something for the next thing to happen, the bad thing.
Yeah, just go back one more time. So that bottom left picture, so I say, like, these cannons, like, they're so unexpected, and you really can't plan. But I mean, we are on the place where other animals do call home, and in that bottom, that small black speck is of a bear that was following me while I was planting there. So despite being on one of the largest industrial projects on Earth, surrounded by like the loud noises of all the mining and of these air cannons, I mean, when that's the bear's home, you can't keep them away.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about when I was flying over all this area that I knew was caribou habitat, or that I knew was caribou range, and was disturbed caribou habitat. Was, we change these landscapes so fast, and there's a lot of wildlife that can or can't adapt rapidly enough to match with that. And there has to be consequences for developing and building these kinds of things in these places where wildlife calls them home.
Yeah, so next slide. So for me, many years have passed since that time, and then it just so happened that I've continued doing work, with different forestry, and then I end up working with an environmental group. And on one of my trips back from visiting my sister, my flight happens to fly above the oil sands, and I go, it's still impressive to this day. And so on April 26th, 2008, I take this picture of the oil sands mines, and so you see Suncor in the foreground and Syncrude in the back, and looking forward to show the people in my office. Wow, look at the footprint that these mines have.
So 2 days later, after Ryan has that flight and takes that photo, is when the really national and international attention is drawn to the oil sands, specifically to the tailings. So at this point, while the oil sands had been, getting some critique from environmental groups, from critics, a lot of that had been up to this point really focused on the emissions of this industry. And so calling it, dirty fuel and all of these things. It wasn't until this day in 2008 when there was this massive tragedy of these 1,600 ducks that landed in a tailings pond and then died. That this other aspect of the oil sands really came to light, that there is this huge landscape impact, and that it impacts the water, it impacts people, it impacts animals. It's not just an emissions issue, it's really the amount of space that this industry is taking up and where it's happening. So at this point, this is, it garners national media attention, it garners international media attention on this industry. It's actually a whistleblower from the company that even tells the news that they have started to find hundreds of dead ducks in a tailings pond. So there are so many aspects of this, of, trying to keep these negative images about this industry quiet, and it happening up in Northern Alberta. Don't think about it, just trust that it's all okay. And this is where, as a society, there's a lot of these concerns that start to grow as well, and really start to question just how safe this could be. And so we get this public perception that starts to change. We have, our personal journeys that have kind of had these questions growing about this industry over our lifetimes. And then it is at CPAWS, when we got to work together, that we finally had the tools to really address a lot of these questions that we had about this industry. So this is a photo of me and Ryan, but it really is a whole team effort. There is a great staff photo in our AGM report that you should look at. It truly represents this. We're just so lucky to be working on this team and to have the support that we can kind of dig into these questions that we have.
Yeah, and as Jillian has mentioned, right, so at CPAWS Northern Alberta, we have such a great team that we're able to bring together so many different skills and expertise in order to bring reports such as the one that we're going to present to the public. And so as one of the great things about supporting CPAWS is that you're able to support a local organization, which can then bring national, because it has a national office, you're able to bring national attention to these issues that could just be local issues with, if it were not for like CPAWS's reach. So we'd like to express our deep appreciation to all our members and supporters for helping us be able to bring you these reports and being able to bring these issues out.
So Ryan and I, about 2-3 years ago, decided to bravely throw ourselves into, not literally, but figuratively throw us into oil sands tailings. And it has been a journey. There's a lot to learn. A lot of it, feels very technical. It feels inaccessible. It feels almost fabricated in a way to just, it's too complicated to understand, like, just don't think about it and just trust it. This is under control. But the more we dug into it, the more we kind of realized that this is a pretty fraught system. So just so we're all on the same page, so when we are talking about tailings, tailings is the waste fluid of the oil sands extraction process. So that is a byproduct of separating bitumen from the clay, sand, and silt using high volumes of water and chemicals. Then that waste fluid is stored in these reservoirs, these open air reservoirs that are called tailings ponds. And these ponds usually have walls or dams. The wall heights can be 100 meters high. Like, these are not insignificant features. The tailings fluid is also considered to be toxic because of the unique components of the oil sands tailings and that process. And the idea of these reservoirs, these storage areas, was that you would take all of this waste and put it into this pond, and that the contaminants would settle out over years, that it would settle to the bottom and separate from the water. And after a few years, it became very apparent that it was not going to separate at all. And actually, the research was showing that it could take up to 150 years for those contaminants to separate from the water. And so it became then a really big issue that we are storing these very tailings pit or these tailings ponds that do contain toxic contaminants. So that's a really big issue because of the region where these tailings ponds are being constructed and where they're being held. So that region in Northern Alberta, it is an ecological marvel. The oil sands is actually at the intersection of 4 migratory flyways. So you have millions of migratory birds that fly over this region twice a year. And so when you have these incidents where the birds land and they die, that's really significant for an area that has millions of birds flying over this region every year. The Peace Athabasca Delta, which is just downstream of the oil sands region, it's where the Athabasca River and the Peace River converge. That's actually one of the world's largest freshwater deltas. It's a Ramsar site, so it's a wetland of international significance. Within the oil sands region itself, there are 14 species at risk. There are 9 at-risk bird species, and those species at risk include things like woodland caribou, wood bison, endangered whooping cranes fly over this area. And then, of course, this area does have a lot of carbon storing peatlands, which is really important for our battle against climate change impacts. And so that's what is at stake in this area. We're already seeing a lot of the impacts on these things. And so I've just included a list of what is known, what's measured, what people are experiencing, but this is by no means a comprehensive list. But we're already seeing things, impacts from the oil sands like air and water pollution, loss of access for Indigenous people to these areas, increases in fish abnormalities and deformities downstream. There's increases in rare cancers in downstream Indigenous populations. There's seepage into groundwater and near surface waters from these tailings ponds. There's lethal exposure to migratory birds. There's irreversible loss of peatlands when a mine goes in. You cannot reclaim a peatland. And we're also seeing the degradation of the Peace Athabasca Delta. So some pretty massive implications of this industry. And so we knew that there was a problem here. We really wanted to contextualize where we were at right now. And what we wanted to do was to look back from the very first oil sands mine that goes in, the very first tailings pond. How did we get to where we are today, looking back that far? And what we found was actually getting publicly accessible information on that was pretty hard. Industry has to self-report on these kinds of things, but the regulator doesn't have to make those accessible or public. So we felt it was really important that this information is in the hands of the public. And so we wanted to make a product that the general public could use and understand, also the downstream communities could have and understand, and to really make that information much more digestible. So this was the report that we made. It came out in May of 2022. It was a partnership with Environmental Defence Canada. And Ryan will explain some of the methodologies that we used for this report.
Yes, thanks, Jill. Oh no, this one is good. Yeah. Yeah, so as Jillian said, like a lot of this data should be reported by governments. There's nothing secretive or inaccessible that the government would not be able to provide this information. It's just that for whatever reasons, it isn't publicly available. And so, yeah, we look to change that. And we also look to be able to combine, as CPAWS Northern Alberta is a science-based organization, we were looking to combine that with traditional knowledge as well. And you'll see that woven into the report as well. So for the first step to bring in, to show what the impact was of the extent of tailings, we were able to get satellite images from 1975 up to the year 2020. So I believe the Great Canadian Oil Sands Company, which is the precursor to Suncor, began operations in the late 1960s. So it was already established by the time we have this first satellite image from 1975. But even then in 75, you can see a pretty prominent tailings pond that is right adjacent to the Athabasca River. And back then it was even, yeah, it was pretty large back then. So what we were able to do is get images, satellite images. They're all based on the Landsat satellite, and there's been several versions of that satellite since 1975. We're now on Landsat 8. And so we have basically a complete time series of the development of the oil sands since 1975. For the mapping, we looked at, as Jillian mentioned, two types of features that were mapped: the fluid tailings and then the associated tailing structures. The fluid tailings are pretty distinct on the map, as they'll show up as a liquid that's not a natural looking liquid, and those would be surrounded by what we defined as tailing structures, which would be all the dams, berms, eventually the end pit lakes. It would be, as well as the other areas that were used to treat tailings. So you'll also notice how when Suncor was doing their tailings reductions operations, which I think we saw a picture of it in Keisha's presentation, those rectangular areas where they have the tailings draining down, those would also be marked as tailings on our maps here. So next slide. And so this is the results of our mapping work, which show a series of 10 maps, which show the growth of the tailings over the past 45 years.
Yeah, so it's definitely pretty drastic when you have them playing one after the other. You can see this growth, a particularly very rapid growth near the end of the series as well. I think the maps and the images are say 1,000 words, so does this one. So I'll summarize some of the key takeaways from our report. So one of the priorities for us in making this report was also then communicating it to the public and making sure that people understood the scope of this issue. So we worked a lot with Elise, our communications manager, and it really was a huge effort to make this very technical work into something that really anybody could understand, hopefully. So one of our first key takeaways for us was the term pond is a bit of an understatement. So tailings ponds is an industry term, but the size of these things are far from anything that would be called a natural pond. The longest tailings pond is about 8 kilometers long. And the largest tailings pond by area, it's actually large enough that it would cover the land footprint of the Edmonton International Airport. So that would be just one tailings pond. So these are really massive reservoirs that we're talking about in this case. And then when you take all of them and put them all together, this whole tailings area is actually large enough to cover the city of Vancouver about 2.5 times. So it's about 300 square kilometers of tailings area in Northern Alberta as of 2020. So it's not an issue of just one large tailings pond. It's, you know, and it's not, oh, we just have to reclaim one very large one. It is a collection, a vast collection of very large problem features. One of the other things that we worked with Elise on was kind of communicating this in a way that people in cities like Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, Montreal could also understand this, because again, this is an issue that happens so far away. It's hard for people to relate and to understand just how vast this is. So this is an overlay of all of those tailings ponds that we mapped over the city of Edmonton. And we then overlaid the LRT routes here. So the blue line and the red line. So you can see actually if you rode the capital line from end to end, it actually would cover just about 3 tailings ponds. So you can kind of imagine riding that train and looking out the window and seeing tailings ponds for that entire extent of that trip. It wouldn't even be all of them. In fact, when you take each tailings pond and place them end to end, they would cover from Calgary to Canmore. So this is a huge, huge issue that we're talking about. And then one of the things that we did with this report was also to kind of refine and take a finer look at some of this data that we were looking at. One of the things, as Ryan mentioned, is that we mapped just the fluid tailings. So even if we just kind of scaled in our scope a bit, and we just looked at what is open water or open fluid, so that would be what's dangerous to migratory birds, to wildlife, that would be what is seeping, what could be an issue with spills and things like that. Even that still is about 120 square kilometers. So still a massive, massive problem. Another way to think about this, which is kind of fun, I guess, and sad, is that it would be about the same size as 240 West Edmonton malls is how much fluid tailings there is in the oil sands surface area. And then because we did a time series, we are then also able to show how this problem has been growing over time. And so the bar here is from 1975 to 2020. It's that total area of tailings growing every 5 years. And so you can see that without this real solution to tailings reclamation, this has been a problem that just has grown and grown and grown. I particularly want to point out what's happening here between the years 2010 and 2015. So that's when the provincial regulator did try to do something about this problem of growing oil sands tailings. They introduced a directive that was explicitly focused on reducing tailings fluid inventory. This directive totally failed. No company met it. And actually our analysis shows that the tailings area actually grew by 40% in between those 5 years. So even when there was this regulatory incentive, there was no change in this industry. And so this is a systemic problem. It's a regulatory problem. Yes.
But Jillian, aren't tailings ponds reclaimed all the time?
Wow, what a great question, Ryan. That, you know, it's fair that that is a question that you ask, because when you Google oil sands tailing reclamation, these are the kinds of things that pop up. That there is the very first reclaimed tailings pond. Suncor trumpets a tailings pond reclamation. Even in the little blurb that pops up on Google tells you that, oh, they successfully reclaimed a tailings pond. You know, this is not true. So that is something that you might hear from industry, but as of this, even today, there is no oil sands tailings pond that has a reclamation certificate. There is 1 square kilometer of the oil sands that has a certificate. So this isn't something that is under control. Suncor, in the case of Suncor's tailings pond reclamation that they talk about all the time, to be clear, what happened there is that Suncor took all of the fluid from one tailings pond and they moved it to another tailings pond. And then they infilled the initial one and planted grass on top of it. And that is what is being called the reclaimed tailings. So the fluid, the actual harmful fluid, was never treated or dealt with. The peatland was never actually reclaimed. So this is really just not truth. And it's really important that these tailings ponds, it's important that we understand that this is a growing issue. Sometimes we hear industry say that it's not a problem that they have so much tailings area because they totally have it under control. It's being safely stored. And unfortunately, it was this year when we saw some real life consequences of having these tailings in this volume in this area. So our report came out in May 2022. In the report, we actually make some cautious observations of things that could go wrong in this area. What are the risks of having 300 square kilometers of tailings in Northern Alberta? And one of those things that we cautioned was this risk of tailings pond seepage, of leaks, and of spills. And little did we know that at that time that we published the report, oil sands company called Imperial Oil was discovering that one of their tailings ponds was leaking. They had found discolored water on and off site. And at that point in May 2022, that was information that did not become public. So we didn't know about that. The company knew about it. The regulator knew about it. And they continue to, monitor the situation. Then 9 months later, after that initial leak is really reported to the regulator, in February is when this massive spill, it's 5.3 million liters that spills out of a tailings area onto public lands in that same area. And so at that time is when the public learned about this spill, but also about that initial uncontrolled seepage, that leaking tailings that was showing that it was actually tailings fluid mixing with groundwater and coming up to the surface, which has huge implications for the impacts of these tailings ponds then. So the company has stated, on their website that this was a combination of equipment problems and process failure. So not really that this is anything that is, unforeseen or unpredictable. It really was like a faulty sensor, essentially, is what they're saying. But incidents like these, especially one where you have a leak that is going on for 9 months that no one really knows about, suggests that this is, again, this systemic issue about oil sands tailings management and the risks of having these companies operate in this area. And so again, just like 2008, this was an incident that really launched oil sands tailings back into national and international attention. There was a lot of media coverage on this. There was a lot of public scrutiny of this incident. In large part, that was because of the advocacy and the leadership of the Indigenous communities that live in this area and downstream of these waters. So particularly the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation were very vocal about the impacts of this incident and how angry they were that they found out at the same time, 9 months later, they found out at the same time that you and I found out that there was these leaking contaminants in the area. And they had people hunting, harvesting, being in the area, eating wildlife from the area. One of the responses to this incident was that there was a parliamentary hearing where they called Imperial Oil as well as the provincial regulator, and they also asked the Indigenous nations to present to the cabinet. These are some quotes by Chief Alan Adam that I just wanted to share. So he was saying at the time that Indigenous peoples need a direct role in how oil sands are regulated and how decisions on tailings are made. He said, "We need solutions. This incident makes us question if this is an isolated problem or a systemic problem throughout the oil sands. And when I say systemic issue, I talk about systemic racism in regard to First Nations, because if this was happening in Calgary, you would be crying from the bottom of your lungs." And I would really recommend watching his opening statement and watching that whole hearing. There's a recording of it. You can also go on our website. We have a blog post dedicated to summarizing these hearings, and you can go to all of those links from there. But there were some really powerful statements made by these Indigenous nations. And I just wanted to add this slide in here because Imperial actually made an update today on this incident. So they had a spill in February. They cleaned up the spill, but that initial leak that I was talking about is really the bigger problem. So that was seeping into groundwater. That started in May 2022. There is still no indication that that leak is controlled at this point, that it has been contained at all. It continues to leak. As of today, the company made a statement that the water sampling is stable at the 4 areas of the shallow seepage. And so if it is stable, then the seepage rate is maintained then. So we would like to see those sampling to decrease. We would want to see declines in the contaminated water being found at those sampling sites. So this is still a very live issue. There's still a Fisheries Act investigation happening. Cabinet is still looking into how they can engage on freshwater issues. And the regulator has just released a report on their investigation into themselves and how they handled the report. And you can take a look, but the spoiler is that they found they did nothing wrong. And yeah, I think in the little last 5 minutes here, I'll just share what is the next complication on top of everything that we've talked about here. So we know that oil sands on the landscape, oil sands tailings on the landscape are a huge environmental risk. They're a huge problem for people. Now what is being discussed is, so how do you reclaim these things? What is a safe and appropriate reclamation option? Well, what is being pushed through right now, particularly by industry, is this idea of treating tailings and then releasing it into the Athabasca River. So treat and release, that is what is meant by that. So there are currently federal and provincial processes that are developing regulations for that. It would have to be a federal authorization. So Canada does have the jurisdiction here to decide if they will allow for the release or not. So we know that the current approach to tailings management is unsustainable. We know that we're experiencing these leaks, these spills, and these companies have to reclaim this area to a near natural state. That is an approval condition. That is the responsibility of the operator when they operate on public lands. And that will require in some way reducing the inventory of tailings fluid. But what is clear is that this treat and release option is really being pushed through because these companies are literally running out of space to put their tailings. So they have only been, their leases are only so big. The tailings ponds, like we said, are massive. They can only continue to put so much volume in them. And so this is frustrating, especially after having done a mapping project where we have seen for 50 years that this problem is growing at at a very constant rate, and that they have known very early on that that they had to do something with their tailings ponds. They knew that they couldn't do end pit lakes, that this couldn't be a solution that's safe. And so it's yeah, I can only explain it as extremely frustrating now to be at a point where you know, it feels it's like this fabricated urgency to push this one solution through. And it just, there's 1.4 trillion liters of tailings fluid in that area. To kind of put all of it on that one single reclamation solution, which also means they can just maintain production. It's not actually reducing tailings ponds themselves on the landscape, is really concerning. And so, you know, just a few notes on the treat and release aspects of it as well. There are other mining industries that do treat and release their tailings, but the oil sands is very different. There are components that are unique to oil sands tailings, things like amphotic acids, there's heavy metals, there's certain kinds of hydrocarbons, there's a lot of salinity that makes treating and then releasing this waste product very different than anything that has been done by any other industry, and makes it quite a dangerous task as well. And so, you know, some of the CPAWS priorities is we dig into this process and we want to engage meaningfully on it, and we want to make sure that our supporters and the public also are aware of these what's happening, and you know, as we learn information and read all of the papers and all the reviews we can get our hands on, we want to be able to communicate that to you as well. So right now there are kind of three things that are standing out to us as we think about the treat and release option. So that's the question of if there would be long-term impacts to downstream waters. So the testing of this option tends to be quite short-term. It doesn't tend to be testing actually for those chronic impacts of something like this. Another question we have is if that treatment technology can actually get the wastewater to a point where it's safe for communities and wildlife. So we would want to see much more robust tests on, again, those more chronic impacts. And also we really want those downstream communities to be, you know, have priority say in what happens to the waters that they drink and that they depend on. And then this third option that gets quite complicated quickly, but if there are, what are all of the alternatives for tailings pond reclamation? And what is the best one? What is going to be the winning combination? But let's not rush into something just because industry is saying that's what needs to happen. And, you know, just one quick note is that we have these problems with oil sands tailings. They're a significant threat to the environment and people. There is no evidence base, there is no approved reclamation solution for tailings ponds, but there are still oil sands mines in review. There are still new ones under construction. With every mine, there comes tailings ponds, and there is still a future of much more tailings ponds on the landscape for Alberta. So while there's these very clear uncertainties in this industry, we do note that the province and the premier was very ready to introduce a moratorium for renewable energy that is facing a lot of the same uncertainties that this industry faces. So uncertainty around a suitable reclamation option, uncertainty around where the best places are for those things, but that this is not something that is ever really applied to this industry. And just really quickly, this issue, I would say the government is very, very intently listening to Canadians on this. They are impacted by what you have to say. They have heard us loud and clear that there's concerns about a treat and release approach, and that the priority needs to be downstream communities and clean waters. So for example, last summer, we ran a campaign that was writing a letter to the government of Canada saying that we really wanted to ensure there were protections for the waters in the Athabasca River, for that Peace Athabasca Delta, for safe tailings management. We ran that for a short 10 days, and in those 10 days, there were 3,500 letters that were sent in by our supporters and maybe some of you in this room, and that actually had an enormous impact. So because of those letters getting into the federal government, we then did immediately see that the minister made some public statements about the treat and release, about oil sands tailings. He had a lot of reporters were calling him. He was getting these letters. We were sending in emails, and he made this public comment in a private interview that, oh, it's okay, everybody, treat and release is just one thing that we're considering right now. We're going to slow down this process. And in this interview, he commits to drinking water quality standards for anything that would be developed for a treat and release. So that's really important to have these kinds of outcomes from a public action. This is something that we can hold the government accountable to. This is something we hold the minister accountable to. So, you know, your support and your action really matters on this work. And we'll let you know whenever there's a good time to use your voice, when you'll get an action from us, any blast. But yeah, thanks so much.